In 1983, David Bowie made the world's most successful album. Let's Dance sold over 10 million copies and turned him into a superstar. But the truth he revealed in interviews years later shocked everyone. During those bright days, he was losing himself inside. Commercial success was killing him as an artist, and nobody noticed. This is the story of the biggest paradox in David Bowie's life. At the moment when the world loved him most, he lost himself the most. But before this story begins, if you love untold stories about music legends, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's dive into David Bowie's darkest period. David Bowie was 35 years old, and his career was at a crossroads. His last album, Scary Monsters, had been successful, but after the glam rock revolution of the 1970s, the music industry had changed. MTV had just been born, and visual image mattered more than anything. Punk rock had come and gone, new wave was rising, and Bowie had to make a decision. Would he continue with experimental music or reach broader audiences? In the summer of 1982, Bowie did something interesting. He went on vacation to the South Pacific. But he didn't just bring sunscreen, he brought his favorite blues and R&B records from the 1950s and 60s, James Brown, Buddy Guy, Albert King, Elmore James. Every day he listened to these records and asked himself, why did I choose this music? The answer was simple. This music wasn't uptight, it came from pleasure and happiness. There was enthusiasm and optimism. Bowie found something in these old recordings that he hadn't felt in years. In the fall of 1982 at the Continental Club in Manhattan, Bowie met producer Nile Rodgers. Rodgers had made history with the disco and funk band Chic. He'd sold millions with songs like Le Freak and Good Times. But lately, his luck hadn't been great. Chic's recent albums had been disappointing. The two men talked for hours about their musical tastes. Blues, R&B, old recordings. Bowie showed Rodgers a photo of Little Richard getting into a red Cadillac and said, "I want my album to sound like this." Rodgers was surprised but excited, and Bowie made him an offer. He wanted him to produce his new album. Rodgers thought Bowie wanted to do experimental work, but Bowie was direct. "Nile, I want you to make hits. I could have chosen any producer, but I chose you." In December 1982, at Bowie's home in Montreux, Switzerland, Bowie played Rodgers his demos. Among them was a folk-style song called Let's Dance. Rodgers was honest. "I come from dance music. You can't call that thing Let's Dance." But in the studio, with Rodgers' arrangements and Bob Clearmountain's engineering, that folk song transformed. Funky guitars, punchy drums, bright saxophones were added. The result would be the most commercial song of Bowie's career. Recording began in December 1982 at New York's Power Station studio. Rodgers was a disciplined producer, starting at 10 in the morning, finishing at 6 in the evening. This was very different from the night recordings Bowie was used to. But Rodgers worked efficiently, and results came quickly. The studio environment was professional but cold. For the first time on an album, Bowie didn't play any instruments, he only did vocals. Most of the musicians around him had never worked with him before. This was a brand new team, including Tony Thompson, Chic's drummer, bassist Carmine Rojas from LaBelle, and horns from Tower of Power. Bowie's close-knit team from the 1970s was gone. This was a commercial operation. The Let's Dance track was recorded surprisingly fast. The young blues guitarist from Texas, Stevie Ray Vaughan, completed his solo parts in just 1 or 2 takes. Vaughan was so unknown that when he arrived at the studio, security tried to stop him. But when he picked up his guitar, everyone fell silent. Those blues tones added unexpected depth to Bowie's pop song. Modern Love was accepted on the first take. Engineer Bob Clearmountain was about to go out and fix the drum tuning after the first take, but Bowie and Rodgers said perfect, and the recording was done. China Girl, the dark song Bowie and Iggy Pop wrote in Berlin in 1977, was transformed into a bright pop version. The original version was electronic and cold. This version was warm and danceable. The entire album was recorded and mixed in 17 days. By music industry standards, this was incredibly fast. Major albums normally took months. This was one of the fastest recording processes in Bowie's career. When the recordings were finished, Bowie was quiet. The result was professional, polished, perfect for radio. But was this really him? His assistant Coco Schwab explained years later in an interview. David looked different. He wasn't happy, but he knew this was going to be successful. Bowie returned to his home in Switzerland and waited for the album to meet the world. At the end of January 1983, he signed the contract with EMI Records, $17 million. It was the highest amount ever given to a rock artist at the time. Bowie was no longer just an artist, he was a major financial investment. On March 14, 1983, Let's Dance was released as a single. Within 2 weeks it entered the UK charts at number 5, then overtook Duran Duran's Is There Something I Should Know to reach number 1. In America it reached the top of the Billboard Hot 100 on May 25 and stayed there for a full 9 weeks. This was Bowie's longest run at number 1 in his career. MTV played the video like crazy. Shot in Australia's red deserts, the clip was visually striking. Indigenous Australians, red shoes, dancing, freedom. Director David Mallet shot both Let's Dance and China Girl videos back-to-back in February 1983. Both videos became among MTV's most played clips. On April 14, 1983, the Let's Dance album was released and success came instantly. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies in the first week. The song's video on MTV was played dozens of times a day. David Bowie was no longer just a rock star. He was a mainstream pop culture phenomenon. 16-year-olds knew him. People of all ages listened to his songs. In May, the first award ceremonies came. Bowie won Best Male Artist. Success continued. The Let's Dance song reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on May 21 and stayed at the top for 9 weeks. The album went to number 1 in many countries. Commercially, it was the biggest success of Bowie's career, but friends noticed a change. Carlos Alomar, Bowie's longtime guitarist, recalled in an interview, "David looked unhappy. Instead of celebrating what he'd achieved, he was keeping his distance. He said, 'Everyone loves me, but I don't recognize this guy.'" On May 18, 1983, the Serious Moonlight tour began in Brussels. The first concert was in front of 15,000 people. When Bowie appeared on stage in his bright suit, the arena went wild. People were crying, screaming, joining in on Let's Dance. It was a professional show. Predetermined choreography, flawless stage lighting, perfect sound system. The stage design was impressive. Designed with Bowie's own contributions, there were giant columns that crew members jokingly called condoms. There was also a large moon and a giant hand decorating the stage. The stage was deliberately given a vertical feeling, described as a combination of classicism and modernism. One set weighed 32 tons, and 2 separate sets were used on the tour. The tour grew month by month. Due to the unexpected success of Let's Dance, plans changed. Instead of small venues, giant stadiums and festivals, one concert received 250,000 ticket requests for a venue with 44,000 seats. Throughout the tour's history, 96 concerts, 16 countries, 2.6 million tickets sold. It was the biggest tour of 1983 and Bowie's longest and most successful tour to date. The performances in the Southern Hemisphere were especially unforgettable. The concert in Auckland, New Zealand on November 26 became the Southern Hemisphere's most crowded concert at the time, 80,000 people. At the US 83 Festival in California, there was a crowd of 300,000. Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak paid Bowie $1.5 million for this festival performance. But the tour was hard for Bowie. The same songs every night, the same choreography, the same costumes. Crew members' costumes were designed down to the smallest detail. 2 sets were made for everyone and worn alternately. His concerts in the 1970s had been spontaneous, different every night. Now every detail was predetermined. Bowie later said, "The Serious Moonlight tour was commercially successful but artistically empty. I was repeating the same show every night." The concert at Montreal Forum on July 13, 1983 was recorded and broadcast on radio stations worldwide. The live version of Modern Love came from this recording. Bowie gave a professional performance, but years later, when describing this period, he would say, "In those shows I wasn't myself. I was playing the David Bowie that people wanted to see." On September 4, 1983, at the Canadian National Exhibition Stadium concert in Toronto, a special moment occurred. Bowie invited his old bandmate Mick Ronson to the stage. Ronson borrowed Earl Slick's guitar and accompanied Bowie on the Gene Genie. Ronson swung the guitar over his head, rocking the stage. Slick watched his guitar in horror. Bowie later told Slick, "You should have seen your face." That moment was one of the most spontaneous and real moments of the tour. During the tour, Bowie's unhappiness grew. He would remain silent for long periods after each concert. Crew members began to worry. Bowie's vitality and creativity from the 1970s had disappeared. Now he was just doing a professional job, emotionless and mechanical. As the tour progressed, one critic wrote, "This is Bowie's most accessible tour because there are very few props and only one costume change, from peach suit to blue." On December 8, 1983, the tour ended at the Hong Kong Coliseum. This date was the 3rd anniversary of John Lennon's death. At the final concert, Bowie and guitarist Earl Slick performed Lennon's Imagine in his memory. They had rehearsed twice in Bangkok a few days earlier. Slick had actually suggested Across the Universe, but Bowie said, "If we're going to do it, let's do Imagine." This was a spontaneous moment, and for the first time in months, real emotion appeared on Bowie's face. But when the tour ended, Bowie immediately went to Switzerland and didn't talk to anyone. The first half of 1984 was one of the quietest periods in David Bowie's career. He was resting at his home in Switzerland, away from the media. But inside him was a question: what did he really want to do? In May, his old friend Iggy Pop visited him. The two men talked for days, remembering their Berlin days in the 1970s. Iggy asked Bowie a question: "David, did Let's Dance make you happy?" After a long silence, Bowie answered, "No, it made me famous, it made me rich, but it didn't make me happy, because that wasn't really me." After that conversation, Bowie returned to experimental music. He made the album Tonight in 1984, but it was rushed and unsuccessful. Never Let Me Down came in 1987, and that was also criticized. The press wrote that Bowie was finished, but Bowie didn't care because he was on a different quest, rediscovering himself. In 1989, he formed the band Tin Machine, a completely experimental project. The album was a commercial failure, but for the first time in years, Bowie was truly happy. "Nobody liked it, but I loved it," he said in an interview. The 1990s were years of discovery for Bowie. He tried different styles, turned to electronics, experimented with the internet. Some albums were successful, some weren't, but he was no longer trying to meet others' expectations. Years passed, and by the year 2000, Bowie was a different man. On the night of June 25, 2000, Glastonbury Festival's Pyramid stage, at least 250,000 people were there to watch David Bowie. The crowd was so large that the next year's festival would be cancelled due to security concerns. Bowie walked on stage wearing a special Alexander McQueen-designed jacket. His hair was long, reminiscent of his first Glastonbury performance in 1971. The concert was magnificent, a wide repertoire from Ziggy Stardust to Modern Love, Heroes to Life on Mars. And yes, Let's Dance was there too. Emily Evis, Glastonbury's organizer, would say years later, "When people ask me what was the best performance I've seen at Glastonbury, Bowie's 2000 concert always comes to mind. It was spellbinding. He had a massive crowd transfixed." Bowie's manager Alan Edwards remembers that night. When the show ended, David was in a trance. He didn't even know where he was. That connection with the big crowd was a spiritual moment. The next day, when we returned to London, everything had changed. One generation had rediscovered David, at least 2 or 3 new generations had discovered him. This concert reshaped Bowie's career. He was no longer under commercial pressure, he was making music on his own terms, and audiences loved the real Bowie. After Glastonbury, the music press celebrated Bowie's return. They ran headlines like "Bowie reclaimed his legend." When Nile Rodgers spoke about the Let's Dance period years later, he said David was right. I taught him how to make hits, but I couldn't teach him how to stay himself. In 2003, Bowie made the reality album Simple and Honest. He went on the A Reality Tour in 2004 and gave happy concerts. But in June 2004, he had a heart attack in Germany and never performed live again. He fell into silence for 10 years. Some thought he was finished, but he returned in 2013 with the Next Day album. And in 2016, he released his final album Black Star just 2 days before his death. This album was Bowie's last work of art, entirely in his own vision, answering to no one. David Bowie died of liver cancer on January 10, 2016. The world mourned his loss. But Bowie's story wasn't just about music. He was a man who had lived through the dark side of success and managed to get out. Over the years, Bowie spoke about the Let's Dance period in many interviews. In an interview in the 1990s, he said, "Let's Dance made me a superstar, but nearly killed me as an artist. I hated being on stage every night during that period because I wasn't my real self." In another interview, he added, "The serious Moonlight tour was a commercial success, but an artistic disaster. I felt like a product. People wanted to see the David Bowie brand, not the artist." A 1999 interview was particularly striking. In 1983, I made a decision. I was going to make money and become famous. I succeeded, but I almost paid for it with my life. Those years taught me that success, if it takes you away from yourself, isn't success at all. Music historians see Let's Dance as a turning point in Bowie's career. Critic Chris O'Leary wrote, "Let's Dance became Bowie's most accessible album, but also his least brave in terms of artistic risk-taking." Bowie spent years trying to escape this album. Nile Rodgers explained years later, "David told me make hits and I did. But I didn't see what was happening to his soul while making those hits. He was a perfect professional. He didn't show his pain. I only learned years later how much he suffered." Today, Let's Dance still plays at weddings, parties, on the radio. People dance, have fun, and that's a beautiful thing because the music makes people happy. But the story behind the song teaches us an important lesson. Sometimes the brightest successes hide the deepest losses. David Bowie escaped that darkness because he made a choice. He chose to be himself. He listened to the artist inside him, not commercial expectations. And what he found in the end was a paradox. When he was himself, people loved him more. Let's Dance holds an important place in music history. It sold over 10 million copies, made Bowie one of the biggest stars of the 1980s, and turned him into one of the icons of the MTV era. But it also became the most striking example of an artist's conflict between commercial success and artistic integrity. It was no coincidence that Bowie deliberately avoided the success formula of serious Moonlight in his 1987 Glass Spider tour. He chose to do a more theatrical, more experimental, less safe show. Critics didn't like it, but Bowie didn't care. He was moving forward on his own path now. The tour's financial success was astonishing, $46 million in revenue, reaching 2.6 million people, made Bowie the artist with the highest-grossing tour in the world that year. But money didn't make Bowie happy. Years later, he would say, "With the serious Moonlight tour, I lost my fans. I didn't know who was listening to me anymore, what they loved. I lost myself." The video for Let's Dance holds an important place not only in music history, but in cultural history. The clip featuring Indigenous Australians as main characters was a bold move in terms of racial representation in the 1980s. Bowie deliberately made this choice, but the video sparked controversy in Australia. Some claimed it was exploitation, others argued it was a historic gesture. The legacy Bowie left us isn't just his music, but a life lesson. Success, if it takes you away from your true self, is actually a failure. And sometimes the bravest move in life is to choose not what everyone expects from you, but who you want to be. David Bowie made that choice, and in the end, he was the winner. Let's Dance introduced him to the world, but returning to himself made him a legend.